Hello and welcome to the fourth episode of Hammer Time with me, Ralph Schoellhammer. First of all, today we have a premiere. At the end of this episode, there will be a 20-minute conversation with Benedict Beckeld about the phenomenon of oikophobia that I have mentioned a couple of times on this show already. And if you head over to Brussels Signal, another medium for which I'm a columnist, you can see the full 50-minute interview that I did with Benedict. I think it's definitely worth your time, so please check it out. I would also ask you, if you forgive me for doing so, to subscribe to my YouTube channel or to subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you enjoyed. First of all, as you can see, we're still a little erratic about the publishing times. I'm following the flow of the news, so sometimes it's a Wednesday, sometimes it's a Friday. I hope that we will get a more fixed schedule in the very near future. But if you subscribe, if you have a notification, you'll always hear and always see when the newest episode is out. And I also want to thank you, the over 1,000 viewers and listeners, for episode number 3. This was a very, very challenging topic. It was a very challenging new endeavor, so I'm very grateful for everybody who stuck with me. Also, very much thank you to everybody who came over from Redacted or the Neil Oliver Show. I hope I can live up to your expectations and you will continue to watch the show. Now, today I want to shift the focus a little bit. In the last episode, I spoke quite a bit about the United States. Today I want to speak a little bit more about Europe and Germany. And this is particularly driven, of course, by what's happening currently in England. I'm sure that most of you have seen the horrific incident that happened in Southport, where 3 young girls were stabbed and killed by an individual with a migrant background. Now, as you can imagine, immediately the debate shifted to whether this was an individual with psychological issues, whether it potentially has a terrorist background, or whether it is something that is completely different. And what we see now as a consequence is that it seems that the patience of the British people is running thin. Over the last couple of hours, we had scenes in Southport, mass riots in front of a mosque. There was some conflicting information. Originally, there was the idea that the perpetrator was a Pakistani immigrant. Now it turns out that he actually is of extraction from Rwanda. So there's still a lot of information coming through, and there was quite a bit of misinformation previously. But I think the problem is we should not look at this incident in isolation. Obviously, what is happening, and this is not just happening in the UK, that the mass occurrence of stabbings, which is a phenomenon that did not happen that often in Europe, continental Europe, but also in the United Kingdom, just a couple of years back. So there is an uptick in this. And even though not every single case has the same motivation, not every single case has the same background, there is a pattern that these things seem to happen more often now. And this is something that one has to talk about. And the reason why this is important is these incidents might seem isolated, but their consequences are not. And what we increasingly see happening is that, as I said before, that the British people seem to lose their patience, that the people in continental Europe seem to lose their patience, because as I will talk about in a couple of minutes, there are similar patterns in Germany, there are similar patterns in France, there are now similar patterns in Austria. I'm speaking to you from the city of Vienna. We had no problems. There were no no-go areas just a couple of decades back. And now there are certain districts of the city that are basically inaccessible at certain times of the day or certain times of night for particular people, especially women. So these are things we have to talk about, because I think there is a tendency, once again, in the mainstream media to kind of put these issues under the rug, or to entirely retell the story, as happened also in the UK, where only bits and pieces of the story are told that somehow make the British people, who somehow make the local population the perpetrators and the actual people who conduct violence the victims. We see the same in Austria, where there are debates about gang violence, that is this gang violence happening because those who join those gangs are responsible, or is it because the Austrians are not welcoming enough? Is it because the Austrians are just so racist and so mean that these young people with the background of from Afghanistan, from Somalia, from Syria, they have no choice. They need to join a gang. They need to perpetrate crime because the Austrians are so mean to them. Now, one would immediately ask the next question, well, if Austrians, or the British for that matter, or the Germans are so racist, then why is it the case that many of these things only happen with a very specific group of people? It's not Asians, right? It's not there is a Chinese community in Austria, nothing's happening there. There's a huge Vietnamese community in France. People tend to forget this, but France did not only have colonies in North Africa, they also had colonies in Southeast Asia. Yet these people don't seem to have the same issues with integration as migrants from North Africa or the Arab world. The same in Germany. We see the same, of course, in the United Kingdom. But depending on where people come from, we have different levels of integration and different participation in crime. Now, as I always say, I know that these topics are uncomfortable. I know that this is something that makes us feel a little bit queasy. It almost has an ick factor. But I think it is important to talk about it because it's also important to say that all of this was foreseeable. I will kind of mention in a few minutes how there was this idea in 2015 that none of these things is going to be a problem, that none of this is going to have any negative effect. But if we take a little bit of a closer look, if we go back in time a little bit, there were plenty of signs and plenty of people who said, listen, this is not going to work out. I just want to mention a handful as a reminder for my viewers both in continental Europe, in the United Kingdom and the United States. Enoch Powell and his famous River of Blood speech took place in 1968, which was the first warning that mass migration into Great Britain will not lead to a happy ending. We had Jean Raspail in France, who published in 1972 his book, The Camp of the Saints, which is a story, it's a dystopian story about mass migration from the Third World into France. But if you read his book, what's fascinating is it's not so much about the people that come to France. It is much more about a French society that lost its will to defend itself. Of course, Michel Houellebecq has picked up a similar topic. So this is not something that it's new, but I think Raspail is more important because he predicted this already in the 1970s. We had in Austria in 1986, Jörg Haider, a famous politician in the German-speaking world, at least in Austria and continental Europe. He took over the now very often called far-right Austrian Freedom Party. And the major topic that he was talking about was once again immigration. This was in 1986. In the early 1990s, there was a public referendum in Austria, I think this is going to be very interesting for our American viewers, that was called Austria First, Österreich zuerst. And the idea behind this was that the Austrian government, the Austrian state, needs to become much more restrictive when it comes to migration, and that priority must be given to Austrian citizens first. Now, in the early 1990s, as you can imagine, this was perceived as a massively racist referendum, like that the Austrians, once again, did not have fully come to grips with their Nazi past, and this is the re-emergence of fascism. But if you look back at this now, it was actually quite prophetic, because many of the things that were mentioned back in the day seem to have come to fruition now. And as we said, this was the case in the United Kingdom with Enoch Powell, it was the case in France with Jean Raspail, and it was of course also the case in Austria with Jörg Haider. Now, very often it is difficult to really put a finger on what is going on. And I'm always reminded of the German playwright Kurt Tucholsky, who had this famous saying in 1931, which sounds much better in German, so please, my German listeners, forgive me if I ruined the translation. But he had this saying that the people are not understanding most things correctly, but they feel them in the right way. So in German it would be, for those who are inclined to hear it, das Volk versteht das meiste falsch, aber es fühlt das meiste richtig. And what he means by this is that even though most people are not experts on the economy, are not experts on migration, are not experts on cultural issues, they have a certain sense on whether or not the society is moving in the right or wrong direction. And I think this is one of the things that we see very strong at the moment. One of the things that I mentioned now was this idea that we heard 30, 40 years ago that migration will be an issue and a problem. But we had other voices as well, and I think it's worthwhile to talk about them. I wrote an article for Brussels Signal about kind of the unspoken truth about migration and how wrong many of the most renowned people were. For example, in 2007, Philippe Legrain published a book with the telling title, Immigrants, Your Country Needs Them. And this was published by Princeton University Press, so a very renowned publisher. And in this book, he claimed that sober-minded economists reckon that the potential gains from freer global migration are huge. So it was basically an entire tome dedicated to the idea that more migration, open borders, will lead to an economic renaissance. Another argument was made by the chief economist of the Deutsche Bank, David Volkerts-Lander, and he proclaimed in 2015 that he can picture a cultural and economic renaissance similar to the one in the decades prior to the beginning of World War I. And he also argued that the best thing that has happened to Germany in 2015 was mass migration. And the World Bank, back in the day, made a similar argument, claiming that migration will be a part of the solution. There is even, by the way, a UN paper, I'll put the link into the comments, that was titled, can hold on to your chairs, replacement migration. So you all remember, you all know that very often the term replacement is supposed to be a right-wing conspiracy theory. But even within the UN, the idea was that the aging populations in the West, kind of the declining economies in Europe, that what will infuse them with fresh blood, what kind of will lead to a renaissance, will be migration, will be mass migration, and it doesn't matter where that migration comes from. And I believe that this is coming to an end. This, I would call it kind of libertarian, neoliberal idea that human beings are completely interchangeable, and it doesn't matter if somebody comes from Somalia or South America, if somebody comes from Germany or Afghanistan and moves to Austria, that all these differences, kind of the economic machine will mold them all into the same form. They all will end up as the same cosmopolitan, post-nationalist, postmodern individuals. And we know now that this is not happening. And in fact, very often the harm that is being done is probably significantly larger than the benefits. To give you just one quick example, if we look at sexual violence in Germany, again, these are all numbers from this was compiled by Mark Wenger, right, whom I highly recommend to follow him on X as well. It just looks at the involvement in gang rapes in Germany. And if you look at those numbers, I mean, it's absolutely astounding. People with an Afghan or African background are proportionally 40 times and 70 times more likely to be involved in gang rapes than Germans. So there is a definite uptick in sexual violence, in rapes, in gang rapes as a direct consequence of migration. Some of you potentially remember the so-called New Year's night in Cologne from a couple of years back, where there was mass sexual assaults on women in the city of Cologne on New Year's Eve. And the problem with this is, and this is something that also needs to be, I think, emphasized much more, we tend to focus very often on the question of terrorism. As I said, does migration lead to more terrorism? Does migration lead to more violent crime? And I think in many areas it does. But we probably have to redefine the concept of what we mean by terrorism. Imagine the following situation. You have a daughter. You live in one of the more problematic areas of Europe, the banlieues of Paris, you live in Malmö, you live in parts of London, and you have a sense that it's no longer safe to walk out your front door. You have a sense that it's no longer safe that your daughter goes out alone at night. Right? So you have a sense that kind of the social cohesion in which you grew up is crumbling away. Now, this is something that is hard to measure, and this is also something that is not going to show up in any kind of terrorism or crime statistic. But if you start to feel ever more anxious about your life, about your surroundings, about your daily social interactions, right? It's both psychologically stressful, but I believe you could make the argument that is a form of it's not kind of terrorism in the textbook definition, but it is a sense of being terrorized. Like if you say that your children will not have a future in that area of the city, in that area of your country, if you sense that you can no longer go on with your life in the way you were used to for such a long time. That is a form of terrorism that is statistically very often not captured, but that is, of course, a reality that we have to face. And the numbers are staggering. Once again, I said today I want to focus a little bit on Germany, because I believe in many ways the direction Germany goes, other countries are following. I will have an extra edition of this podcast where we'll talk a little bit more about the kind of cultural ideological dominance that German ideas still have. I'm sure, as many of you know, the influence not just of Marx, but also of the Frankfurt School and other German philosophers is much stronger than we generally are willing to acknowledge. And that's still the case today. In many ways, the world thinks, so to speak, in German ways. This idea that an ideology must be pursued even though it collides with reality. The idea that it's tragic for reality, but not for the ideology, if the former is not the same as the latter, which is, by the way, a saying from Hegel, who once was told that his theories don't add up to reality, and he said, how tragic for reality. And I think this is what we see. Now, in the next graph from the Financial Times, we have compiled the net migration that took place between 2013 and 2022. And if you look at the case of Germany, in those 9 years, almost 6 million people migrated to Germany, more than any other European nation on the continent. And this is a staggering, this is an astounding number. This is about the same number that the United States had under the Biden-Harris administration. It's slightly less of illegal crossings of the southern border. But of course, the United States are a significantly larger country, so they, at least hypothetically, can absorb it. In the German case, this is going to be significantly more difficult. And of course, that this has social consequences. We'll also talk about this in a little bit, that this has financial consequences, can no longer be denied. Another graph that I think is very, very intriguing also from the Financial Times, and we also looked at it at Brussels Signal, tells us a little bit about what the fiscal consequences about migrants. Now, in Anglophone countries, migration still overall seems to have a net positive effect. In non-Anglophone countries, absolutely not. Now, if you look at Belgium, France, the Netherlands, but also Sweden, as you can see on this graph, migration overall is a burden on the taxpayer and not an asset. I have been talking about this in a previous show, so I don't want to go over all the numbers again. But generally speaking, it has become absolutely clear that the kind of migration strategy that continental Europe has pursued in the last 3 or 4 decades was not an economic benefit. So we need to ask the question, why did they do it? And this brings us back to an issue that I also mentioned on my last episode, when we talked about that the German government or the German foreign ministry under Annalena Baerbock is basically allowing people illegally to come to Germany, right? Where embassies and consulates in Syria, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan have been advised by the foreign ministry back in Berlin to accept either non-existing or forged documents in order to get visas. Now, why would anybody do this? What is the purpose behind this? And this is an ideological idea. There is on the left this concept that borders really are something of the past, that all people are the same, that passports or documentation is a reactionary concept, that no person is illegal, that everybody should have the ability to move to your country whenever they please. And this is now not just a theory, as we see in the German case, this is something that has been enacted. And by the way, kind of a slight defense of the Greens in Germany, this has been enacted beginning under Angela Merkel. So this was not just a left of center or radical left policy. This was also a policy that was pursued by the so-called center-right or the so-called conservatives. Another graph I want to show about net migration to Germany, kind of where do people come from. This was compiled by my friend Paul Venitas. I also highly recommend you to follow him on X. You find him under Dr. Venitas, and he does a great job in compiling data from official sources and putting them into graphs. And what you can see on this graph is that between 2013 and 2022, the numbers that we just talked about, that out of those 6.3 million people, almost 2 million people came from the Middle East and North Africa, 1.5 million came from Eastern and Central Europe, and then the other numbers come from Russia, the former Soviet Union, the Balkans, a little bit, 400,000 comes from the Western European Union, even less comes from East and Southeast Asia, 250,000 from Sub-Saharan Africa, and about 150,000 from America, while over 500,000 people have left Germany. Now, if we would dig a little bit deeper into those numbers, what you, by the way, would find out is that most of the people, particularly the 1.7 million from the Middle East and North Africa, is unskilled labor, whereas the 570,000 people that left Germany is skilled labor. So the big irony in German migration policy, and I would argue in European migration policy, is that we are told we need more migration because we have a lack of skilled labor. But what in fact is happening, that mass migration makes the living conditions in some areas so unbearable, it leads to such tax increases, because all of these must be financed, that the actual skilled labor that exists is leaving the country, and skilled labor that is abroad decides not to come. Why would a talented software engineer from India, if he or she would choose between the United States and Germany, come to Germany? Taxes are higher, living conditions are declining, schools are more problematic, the education system is worse. It's much better for them to go to the United States. So there you can see this odd thing that is happening, that the very thing, migration, the very problem that migration is supposed to solve, it actually makes worse. And one other consequence of this is, and I'm going to want to bring this in a broader context, is, as we can see by this graph from Pew Research, that people are becoming increasingly anxious about the future. There is a massive number all over Europe where people think that their kids will be worse off financially, but also otherwise, than they themselves are. There are a few exceptions. Now, if we can look at these numbers in a little bit of greater detail. So where do we find optimism, or somewhat like optimism in Europe? So in Poland, 48% believe that their kids will have a better life than they do, compared to 39% who don't think so. Even in Hungary, and usually the Hungarians are known to be one of the more pessimistic people in Europe, even there 41% believe that their children will have a better life than the current generation. How does it look like in the United Kingdom? In the UK, 68% believe that the next generation will be worse off, compared to 24% who believe they will be better off. In France, 71% believe that the next generation will be worse off, compared to 9% who believe that they will be better off. Germany, 52% believe that the next generation will be worse off, compared to 36%. Even in the Netherlands, 54% believe that the next generation will be worse off. By the way, it's also really bad in Russia, because I know, if you forgive me saying this, that some on the right believe that Russia is a little bit the land of the future, but even there, 24% believe that the next generation will be worse off, whereas 52% believe that they will be better off. So say whatever you want about the Russians, it looks as if they are more optimistic about the future than Western Europeans are. And this brings me to another issue, when we look at this anxiety about the future. A society that is so worried about what the next generation is going to experience is probably not going to be a society that is doing very well. Now, Neil Ferguson formulated what he called Ferguson's Law, and I find this quite intriguing. So he put out this post on X, and it says, "Any great power that spends more on debt service than on defense will not stay great for very long. True of Habsburg Spain, true of the Austrian regime in France, true of the Ottoman Empire, true of the British Empire. This law is about to be put to the test by the US beginning this very year." And this is from June 22nd, 2024. Now, I think Ferguson is right. I think the idea that he's putting forward, and we have another graph that shows this as well, that once the debt service is overtaking defense spending, I think you are in deep trouble. So I think he's absolutely right. Ferguson focuses most on international relations and finance. I take the liberty now and propose something that I would call Schoellhammer's law. And what I mean by Schoellhammer's law is, what happens if the actual cost on migration is overtaking defense spending? And we have the numbers for Germany. Like, Germany is not yet there, but Germany is very close if we look at the numbers. In the year of 2023, the expected expenditure on flight and migration will be approximately 48.2 billion. So this was after already 42 billion in 2022. So these are the official numbers according to the newspaper Die Welt. And if we go back then and look at the defense budget from 2021, the German government spent 46.9 billion euros on defense. So Germany is reaching the point where they have to spend more money on migrants, on asylum seekers, on the welfare state, than they have to spend on defense. Now, once again, why is this important? Because it shows you that mass migration is a structural weakness. Diversity is our strength is a nice slogan, but it has nothing to do with reality. You cannot have a successful country where you have to spend more money on integrating people, where it's very questionable whether they even want to be integrated, than you spend on your military defense, than you spend in your capacity to be a global actor, to be a great power, in the case of Germany, a medium power. So if Ferguson's law is about debt service and defense spending, Schoellhammer's law is about spending and migration and defense. And I think in the European case, the latter will be more important than the former. And this, by the way, does not include all the kind of absurdities with which the Germans are cheating when they talk about defense spending. To give you one example from an article in the NZZ, the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, a top publication from Switzerland, this includes the pensions for GDR, the German Democratic Republic soldiers, so the former East Germany, child benefits for members of the Bundeswehr. So even the German defense spending is basically, to a large part, just another term for social benefits, for welfare spending. So the actual money that arrives at the German armed forces is very, very small, is very limited. And what it also shows you, that the German state, the German government is coming to the brink of bankruptcy. There's still this idea very often around, oh, the Germans, they'll be fine. They are frugal, they are well managed, they know exactly what they're doing. But unfortunately, that might have been the case up until the 1980s, but it is no longer the case. So what they do is they use accounting tricks. So we have a great graph here that shows the regular German budget, which is approximately slightly under 500 billion euros. But then they have created what they call special funds for climate, for energy, for military, and all other kinds of things, which is above 800 billion euros. So just to get this straight, right? So there's an official budget of the German government, of the German state, that's approximately 500 billion euros. And then you have almost 1 trillion euros of so-called special funds. So this is, of course, a way to just rephrase going into debt, because these special funds, right, is still money that must come from somewhere. So this is still going to be something that the German taxpayer is going to be burdened with, or that future generations are going to be burdened with. But as you all know, if you look at the German birth rate, there will not be a next generation, and that generation that is going to be there will to an ever larger degree consist of a migrant population that at this point simply is not integrating into the labor force. Once again, we have the numbers for that. Right? We know, for example, that in the German state of Hesse, 74% of welfare payments, which is the German version of basically an unconditional income, goes to people with non-German passports. So this is not migration into the labor force, this is not migration into the labor market, this is migration into the welfare state. And the numbers are all there, yet somehow still, particularly the media, is pretending as if that is not happening, as if nothing of that kind is going on. And there seems to be a tendency of countries outside of Germany to follow Germany down that road. So I'm always very surprised when I hear debates about this issue in France, in the United States, in the United Kingdom. You can see what is going on in Germany, you can see the effects, you can see that this kind of mass migration from culturally non-Western countries is financially, socially, economically neither feasible nor sustainable. Yet somehow it seems that everybody has signed on to that program. Now, some people might ask, okay, fine, if the Germans have all these special funds, then maybe it is invested in infrastructure, right? Maybe the Germans do quite a bit with that money to make sure that the trains run on time, right? That everything is working smoothly. Well, my friend Dr. Paul Vanitas has put a nice graph together about this as well, where he looks at tax revenue versus gross investment into public transport in Germany. And as you can see in this graph, right, tax revenue is going up, so the German state is taking ever more money from the population, but the actual investment into public transportation, in infrastructure, is declining. So one has to ask the question, what's happening with all that money? Where is all that money going? And this is another issue that we will explore in greater detail in future episodes. There is a tendency all over the West, once again, to spend money where it's not needed and not to have any money where it is needed. And Germany is no exception there. I'm sure that many of you or some were watching the Euro Championship this summer, and some of you might even went there. And this was a test. Like, it was a test whether or not reliability, efficiency, and things coming and running on time, whether this is really something the Germans are known for, right? Whether the reputation of German punctuality, of German precision is justified. And as we'll see in a minute, even the New York Times titled that, no, right, this was all a myth. This simply did not happen. Germany is no longer the country that it was a couple of decades ago. And this is primarily due to the dominance of a left-wing ideology. But as I said before, where Germany goes, many other countries follow. And there's one example that I enjoyed tremendously. This is from the United Kingdom, about a staircase at a subway station. And I think this is a fantastic tweet. I want to read it to you real quick. It says, after 10 years, I'm proud to see the second staircase at Surbiton Station officially opened. It is fantastic to see constituents and commuters using the staircase and the benefit it is already having on improving congestion. Thank you so much to everyone that has made this possible. So, it took the British 10 years to build the staircase. I mean, I'm glad that Mr. Davy is happy about this, but this is not an example for things running smoothly. This is not an example for things running well. Never forget that, just to give you another example, the Empire State Building was built in 2 years. The Hoover Dam was built under time and under budget. So there were periods in Western history where we could build massive infrastructure projects in a very short time. The American interstate highway system, all the things on which our modern society still run today, right, were built in a surprisingly short time with significantly less advanced technological means than we have today. But nowadays, nothing can get done anymore because there is bureaucracy, there is regulation, and there is a certain unwillingness to simply get things done. And it's not just the UK. Let me give you another example from the United States. As you all know, Joe Biden and his staff, they were all in on EVs. And they invested $7 billion in EV charging stations over the last 2 years. Now, I would like to ask you to guess how many charging stations they actually built. The answer is 7. That comes down to about $1 billion for a single charging station. Again, this is not how you run a functioning country. So when I talk about what ails the Germans, what ails the German economy and the German people, this is something that is also happening in other countries. This is not just a German problem. Another thing that we see happening is record delays at the German, as I mentioned before, at the Deutsche Bahn, at the German railway station. Less than 70% of trains were on time. Now, and I want to remind you, there is always this kind of mythological story that one of the things that fascists did was they made trains run on time. Now, you can rest assured that if running trains on time is a characteristic of fascism, the Germans are further away from fascism than they have ever been in their entire history. There is no risk, or there's a slight risk. The bigger risk is that you are on time when you take a German train than not being on time. And once again, this hints at a much larger topic. There's a growing sentiment, as Tucholsky said, right? The people probably don't really understand it, but they feel it. That things are no longer working the way they're supposed to be. Infrastructure, the welfare system, public programs, health services, that somehow there's a sense of decline, and I think that sense of decline is absolutely justified, and that this is something that is happening. As I mentioned before, even the New York Times could not deny that the year 2024 and German efficiency, forget everything you thought you knew. So in many ways what was happening was an episode, if you want, of 2 months almost, where the Germans showed that they are no longer what they once were. But I would make the same argument, by the way, for France. I'm sure that many of you have enjoyed and observed the debates about the opening ceremony and whether there was a play on the Last Supper or whether it was in fact something taken from Greek mythology. But I think that's all besides the point, right? I mean, this is a story that's important and we can talk about in greater detail. But almost hidden between the headlines was then the other news piece, which was that the men's triathlon had to be postponed because of pollution levels of the River Seine. So once again, it shows you how the priorities in the West are entirely upside down. So maybe the French, instead of focusing on a transgender opening ceremony, should have focused on making sure that the actual event can take place. So that the level of transgender participation probably is not as important as the level of pollution in the River Seine. Right? We saw the same in Germany. Maybe instead of focusing on making these the most diverse soccer games and football games of all times, maybe they should have focused on making sure that actually people can get to the games. But this is the thing that people sense intuitively, that there's an inversion of priorities in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and in continental Europe. And another part as a concluding point for today, I always talked a lot about how the media is colluding with governments or with the powers that are in making this happen. But I think the same is true when we look at big tech companies. Some of you probably already heard about this, and I can only suggest that you try it yourself. If you try to Google Trump assassination, or if you try to Google or use AI to describe what happened in Butler, Pennsylvania to Donald Trump, it's very difficult to find information on this. So what we see from Meta AI, but also from Google, is the attempt to memory hole in real time the assassination attempt on an actual former and potential future president. Just to give you an example, so if you ask Meta's artificial intelligence, can you give me details on the assassination attempt on Donald Trump? The answer is, I can't assist with that. I don't always have access to the most up-to-date information. Can I help you with anything else? Well, right, then they try something else. Was Trump almost assassinated? And they give you a couple of examples, but none of them includes what happened in Butler, Pennsylvania. So this is, once again, an attempt, as I talked about in our last show, to rewrite history in real life. And this is not just a matter of politicians. This is not just a matter of what's happening in politics. This is also a matter of the collusion between the media and big tech, which I would argue are ever more brazenly have it taken upon them to tell people that what they see with their own eyes is not true. I mean, there is this saying by George Orwell that those who control the present control the past, and those who control the past control the future. And this is precisely what is currently being attempted. You rewrite history, you rewrite the character of Kamala Harris, you rewrite the assassination of Donald Trump. Because if you control the narrative, if you control the past, you also can control what's happening in the future. And that will ensure, this is what they try to do, to entrench that the existing regimes will never have to let go of power. So in many ways, what you see happening is a coup, but it's not a coup from the bottom against the top. It's a coup from the top against the bottom. And as I said at the beginning of today's show, most people feel it, even though they don't have the right words to describe it. But I think they're right. And I think it is the obligation of podcasters like me and other people in the alternative media to give a voice to that feeling, which I think is correct. And one step into this direction is, which will follow now, is the conversation that I had with Benedict Beckeld, because I think he describes very well one of the motivating forces behind what is going on. And one of these motivating forces is oikophobia, right? Is the kind of self-hatred, the hatred of home, the kind of inconvenience, the discomfort that many in the West feel with their own society, with their own culture. And that drives a lot of the things that are going on. I do believe that, as we talked about previously, that the migration policies we see at the moment are perceived on the left as a form of atonement for the sins of the West. But of course, at some point, this atonement might be lethal, might be suicidal. And this is going to be the topic also for the coming weeks. Now I hand it over to Benedict, and I hope very much that you enjoy this conversation. We'll see each other again next week for episode 5 of Hammer Time. I can introduce you today to Dr. Benedict Beckeld, a writer, philosopher, and academic who proves once again the point that one does not have to spend a lot of time on Twitter or X to be a truly great thinker. Actually, I start to increasingly believe that the less time people spend on social media, the smarter they are. And Benedict is a wonderful example of this. Benedict, if you wouldn't mind, in a few sentences, could you introduce us to yourself and what you're currently up to, what your main projects are at the moment? And then I'm very much looking forward to one particular topic that you're working on, and that is the concept of oikophobia and the self-hatred of the West. You've also written in 2022 an excellent book on the issue that was published by Cornell University Press, which I highly recommend to all our viewers and listeners. You appeared on fantastic podcasts. You were on with Victor Davis Hansen. You were on the Lotus Eaters. So you're both a prolific writer. You're on with Peter Boghossian. So you have spoken to quite a number of the most relevant thinkers today, and I would count you among them as well. So I'm very much looking forward to your take on the concept of oikophobia. But maybe you can tell us a little bit more about yourself just in a few sentences, because, as I said, you're so underrepresented on social media that it's probably very hard for many of the people who enjoy your work to find you.
Yeah. So thank you. And you're right. Yeah, this is actually a bit of it's something that I've struggled with myself, because precisely as you say, one has to be present on social media to sort of put one's work out there. But as you say, it tends to interfere with the process of one's thinking and so on. So it's one is between a rock and a hard place there. But yeah, so I'm a philosopher, as you mentioned. I was trained academically, mostly in Germany, actually, at the University of Heidelberg, where I got my PhD in philosophy and classical philology. And but I'm an American citizen, and I live here in New York City. But so what I'm working on right now is, so you mentioned oikophobia. This has been my work that's been going on for many years, and that culminated, as you mentioned, in my book Western Self-Contempt, which came out a couple of years ago. But I've continued to write on that subject, or in terms of various articles and so on that involve the subject and where the United States and Europe are heading in terms of their cultural self-hatred, which is what oikophobia means. So this has been a lot of my work. Right now I'm actually working, my newest book project is actually more in the field of aesthetics, which was one of my early, which was my first love really in philosophy. But it also involves how aesthetics and how our views of art and so on tie into political philosophy as well. And what it says about us as a society. But yes, oikophobia is the most crucial, or one of the most crucial key terms to understand if one wants to know what is happening right now with the West and with Western Europe and the United States in particular.
So, in layman's terms, how would you describe oikophobia to a general audience, like somebody who is not trained in philosophy, who is not trained in political thought? What would be the way in which you would describe it?
Yeah, so oikophobia, literally the fear of home, or the hatred of home, as you might sometimes translate it, is essentially what happens to a modern Western culture. It has also happened to antiquity, but to an advanced Western culture that starts to turn inward, and instead of being focused on external enemies or external threats, it basically starts to view itself in the mirror, and it starts to question itself. And that self-questioning, which can, of course, also be a good thing, but that self-questioning eventually tips over into outright self-contempt and self-hatred. And so oikophobia is where we find ourselves right now, and it has happened again in history. It happens under certain socio-historical circumstances. One can trace it back all the way to ancient Greece. But right now, we find ourselves in the grip of oikophobia, more extremely so in Western Europe than in the United States, but it's certainly also a big problem, of course, here in the United States, as I think everybody can see, with large segments of our populace hating America, with a lot of Americans hating the United States and thinking that the United States is the fount of all evil and everything like that. That is basically what oikophobia means. And so it's interesting to study and to understand why this actually happens in history, because then, of course, we start to understand what can be done about it as well.
Can you explain to us a little bit how you came to think about this? Because your book was published in 2022, but this, of course, means that you wrote and thought about this issue at least, I would say, 5 years or a decade before that. I mean, now I think you described this absolutely correctly. We see now the burning of American flags, kind of the general condemnation in the United States, but also in Europe of our own history. But it's easy to say that oikophobia is happening now that we see it with our own eyes. But you kind of caught on to that topic. You were ahead of the curve already a decade ago. So how did it happen that you sensed the evidence for this is happening, or that you sensed that something was building up in the realm of oikophobia?
Yeah. So you're right. As you know yourself, academic publishing tends to be a very slow process. So if something comes out in 2022, it means one has been working on it for many, many years before. So what happened, and I'm sure I'm far from the only one, basically, I actually describe it a little bit also in the book itself, but not too much. It basically just started as personal observations and noticing this sort of knee-jerk reaction, especially in academia, of course, because that is where these things tend to be centered, but then also in society at large, about how people would just assume that the United States was the worst in the world, or that Europe was the worst in the world. It was a sort of something that people just assumed without even thinking about it, and it was very noticeable. So I started thinking about this. It was in the late 2000s, actually, that it started to sort of crystallize in my mind, if you will. And then, of course, I came across this term, oikophobia itself, which was coined by Roger Scruton, the late Roger Scruton. He had coined it in the 90s, but he didn't write that much about it. He wrote an article about it, and then he had a book chapter in a book, which England and the Need for Nations, which came out in 2004. He dealt with it in a brief chapter. And so he was describing a concept that I had already noticed. And so I became interested in using this word and in just going a lot deeper and a lot further than he had done. And so I started writing about it. My first article on it came out in 2019 from Quillette. But then by the time I got the book out, as you said, it was 2022. It actually was helpful. Obviously, I wish that it hadn't happened, but as you can imagine, academic publishers, of course, they tend to not to want to publish anything that can be perceived as conservative or as even mildly right-wing. First, I had received a lot of no's from academic presses, and then actually the riots happened here in the United States in 2020. And by that time, I had already been in touch with several editors at various academic presses. And I had received a lot of no's, and then there was this one editor at Cornell whom I then alerted. See, look at what's happening here. This is what I've been talking about, pointing at the riots and the graffiti on the statues of American founders and so on. This is what I've been talking about. I mean, this is the perfect illustration. And that actually, in a way, probably helped me a little bit in terms of the publishing process, because a lot of people sort of said, yeah, that's interesting. You may be onto something. And so, obviously, which is not to say that I wish that it had happened, but then finally it saw fruition that way. Yeah.
Very often the phenomenon with oikophobia is described as something that comes from postmodernity, right? It's a postmodern phenomenon. Some people like James Lindsay would say it's something that's out of Marxism, communism. But you hinted at something by saying that similar things happened in antiquity. So I think this would be an interesting way to look at this. So what parallels do you see? Or is it possible that kind of every civilization runs through a phase of postmodernity and then either find itself at renewal or at decline and disappearance? But I think the argument that we constantly think about ancient Rome is probably true, but when it comes to the very specific phenomenon of self-hatred, how would you make the comparison to antiquity? And how would you react to the claim that this is a kind of a Marxist communist phenomenon? Because this is something I'm not happy with, but I'd be very happy to hear and very interested to hear your take on this.
Yeah, the idea that it's not completely false, that, I mean, Marxism and postmodernity certainly have something to do with it. But it's more than that. So it would be more accurate to say, I think, that Marxism and postmodernity and the Frankfurt School, all of these sort of terms and movements and buzzwords that people like to use, they certainly play a part in it. And I trace that ideological thread, if you will, from Karl Marx through the Frankfurt School through certain French postmodernists up to the present day. That thread certainly can be established. But as you mentioned, it's something that that happens to ancient civilizations as well. So it's more accurate to say that when a civilization goes through, approaches its oikophobic phase, it will find various ideologies to latch onto in order to advance oikophobia. So in ancient Greece, in late 5th century Athens, early 4th century Athens, relativism, the whole debate of nature versus law, right? The whole debate about convention versus absolute truth was in vogue. And so the whole idea of moral relativism was the philosophy by which a lot of people were able to latch on in order to advance oikophobia. And obviously we have a lot of relativists in that sense today as well. But so there will be individual variations from civilization to civilization. But the specific ideologies or the details of the specific ideologies will differ, yes. But it ultimately boils down to a very similar type of phenomenon. When it comes to ancient Rome was actually had somewhat less oikophobia. I talk a little bit about that in the book as well, than ancient Greece, because ancient Greece, and in particular Athens, was a much more open intellectual space for a particular period, at least for several decades of its existence, which was not quite the same. It wasn't that to the same extent in ancient Rome, and so and the ancient Romans also had a much stronger sense of hierarchy and of patriarchality than the Greeks did, so that also served as a bulwark against oikophobia. But we see the same pattern develop in ancient Rome as well. So obviously there are many reasons why ancient Rome disintegrated. Oikophobia is only one of them. There are many others, but the oikophobia still plays a role. One stops to believe in oneself. One stops believing in one's own gods, in one's own traditions, and so on. That's perfectly traceable in Rome as well. And so when you mention renewal and or collapse, collapse is the more, certainly in antiquity, collapse is the result, not renewal. Now, today in the modern world, we don't have Visigoths or Vandals crowding at our borders, about to invade us when we become oikophobic. So in that sense, we're not necessarily going to collapse, but we will sort of wither away and will become decreasingly relevant geopolitically. Now, of course, even though there are no Visigoths or Vandals or Ostrogoths and so on, there are still, of course, peoples in the world who think very differently from the way we do. And to some extent, the United States, but of course, in particular, Western Europe, is experiencing this in the sense that because it's less dramatic, obviously, than was the case in the Roman Empire, where you have actual armies crossing the borders and overwhelming Roman garrisons and so on. But in a less dramatic way, the same thing is playing out in Western Europe in the sense that with a lot of West Europeans no longer believing in their own culture, they are no longer willing to defend it before the waves of immigrants that are flooding their countries.
Do you think that in many ways some of the philosophies and ideologies we talk about today, that they are more a symptom than a cause? Like what you just described, for example. So you lose faith and trust in your own civilization, your own culture, and then you try to find something else to latch onto. So Marxism, wokeness, I think spirituality probably would also, and the day beyond this, that this is just a symptom of a population or of a civilization that no longer believes in its own past, so they try to find something else. And it's a little bit of a roll of a dice what that something else might be. Could we even say in a more provocative way that Christianity might not have been successful if Rome would have been more confident in its own beliefs and its own traditions and its own culture, that in many ways it was a stroke of luck that Christianity then took over, but it probably could have been something else as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one sees that, so I guess I get to the first part of your question first, but basically it's a symbiotic relationship, I would say. So certainly it often happens, and one sees this, of course, in individual cases. It very often happens that it doesn't necessarily happen that someone is a staunch conservative and patriot and so on, and then suddenly comes across Das Kapital of Marx and becomes an oikophobe. Very often it's young, disillusioned people who already don't believe in anything, and then they find these ideologies to latch onto. Of course, that does happen a lot. And historically as well, I mean, one sees a weakening of the culture. It begins usually with a weakening of the religion. One no longer believes in God or the gods in ancient times. And then that opens up the space for these other ideologies to come in. And you mentioned spirituality and so on. One will often, before these things become crystallized in Marxism or postmodernism or whatever it may be, these things become codified by intellectuals. But before these things become codified by intellectuals, there is this sort of aimlessness and the replacement of traditional religion with various superstitions, with physiognomy and vegetarianism even. That might sound provocative to some people, but that's a repetitive pattern as well, and so on. Pop spirituality, Eastern religions, Eastern cults. Buddhism would be the perfect example today. Other Eastern cults or Eastern religions in ancient times, they come in to fill the vacuum, and then various intellectuals crystallize these or make these various ideologies more concrete. So that's something. And then, of course, that further feeds oikophobia once those things have been established. And so in that sense, I would say it's a symbiotic relationship. When it comes to Christianity in the Roman Empire, I think that's entirely right, what you say. For a long time, and one sees this in various historians, Tacitus, Suetonius, sort of around 100 AD or so, before Christianity has made a lot of inroads, but already then there is a sort of mocking of religion, and Juvenal and Tacitus, they complain about how Roman women, they don't go to sacrifice to the traditional Roman gods. Rather, they go to Jewish soothsayers, which, of course, from the Roman perspective, is an Eastern cult or an Eastern religion. And then, of course, Christianity is the Eastern cult. Or the Eastern religion that ultimately proved successful. But yes, it's able to do that because by that time the groundwork has already been laid, or the Roman soil has become fertile for this kind of thing, because everything else has sort of been marginalized already. Yeah.
So now I have two questions, and I'm not sure which one to ask first. Maybe I can combine them.
Yes.
When would you say, I know this is not a precise science in this case, of course, but if you would have to put your finger on a date, when would you say approximately in the modern West did oikophobia start? So it varies from country to country, and this is something I lay out a bit more in the book, because I have separate chapters for various countries. So it starts. Probably won't come as a surprise to a lot of people. It starts in France. In talking now about the modern world, of course, the French always have to be at the forefront of everything, for both good and bad. So it starts around the if we're going to talk about a date, mid 18th century. So basically with the Enlightenment, and with the Diderot, the Encyclopédie, and Condorcet, Voltaire, all those people. That's what it's sort of. Now.
again, it doesn't arise ex nihilo, right? It doesn't come out of nothing. Before that time, religion has already started to be weakened. Atheism has already started to become more and more salonfähig, as we would say in German, has more and more acceptable, right? And the Catholics of France, for example, they hate Protestants more than they hate atheists. For example, they hate the Huguenots more than they hate freethinkers in their own midst. So already there is a weakening of religion going on in the early 18th century before Enlightenment, before the Enlightenment has begun to arise. But to put a date on it, basically 1750s thereabouts in France. And then if you're going to look at other countries, now the French are at the forefront. If you look at Great Britain, we're talking more about the late 19th century. And there is a reason for this, right? Because when a civilization is at its peak in terms of power and geopolitical influence and so on, it still has a lot of confidence in itself because it can see how it's laying waste, so to speak, to surrounding areas or how it's dominating other areas. And for France, that is about the time. I mean, it's really Louis XIV, so that peak is a little earlier. But they're still sort of coming off that high, that civilizational high, if you will, by the time the 1750s come around. Similarly, in England, if one wants to put their civilization at a peak in terms of geopolitical influence and so on, it would basically be around the 1860s, thereabouts, 1870s maybe. And so one sees late 19th century, late Victorian England, that's where this starts to happen. One sees it especially with the Boer War, right? So right at the cusp of the turn of the century there, where more and more speeches come about that take the side of the Boers and that say that the English are the bad guys and so on. And so that's later in England. And then again in the United States, it's even later because, again, we are sort of delayed, if you will, vis-a-vis Europe on that historical trajectory. Our peak here in the United States obviously comes after World War II, basically 1950s. And so our oikophobia sets in a little later. Now, of course, we are living in such an interconnected global world that whatever happens in Europe is going to reflect what happens in the United States and vice versa. So it sometimes that gives the impression that sometimes that all of the West became oikophobic around the same time because we're all sort of this obsession with racism and with oppression from white males and so on. This is a discourse now that is taking place on both continents simultaneously. But in fact, the actual signs of oikophobia, that's just the most modern expression of oikophobia. The earliest signs of oikophobia did arise at different moments in different countries. Yeah.
Do you think, would it be fair to say, or would it be too provocative to argue that kind of the catastrophe of World War I ultimately broke the Whiggish interpretation of history that things tend to always get better and that progress can never be stopped, and that also kind of shattered the self-confidence of Europe in particular, and that in some way, even Bolshevism, probably Bolshevism less so for different reasons we can probably go into, but that fascism, at least the Italian version, but maybe then also the German version in the form of National Socialism, that these were actually also kind of reactions to oikophobia in a sense. Kind of what you described early on, right? Yet this emptying out of the confidence in the original structure of society and the system, and then some new ideas tried to take that place, and the kind of even fascism would fall into that category.
Yeah, absolutely. So the reaction to oikophobia. So yeah, World War I is. Yeah, I mean, as you imply, I think I would say World War I is the conflict from which Europe never recovered, basically, and in that sense, from a purely cultural point of view, it's actually more dramatic than World War II, even though, of course, in a purely physical sense, World War II was even worse. And the reaction that you find, this is why there is the reaction, and now the reaction takes many different forms. The most extreme form of such a reaction is indeed, obviously, fascism, in particular the German form, but to some extent also the Italian form. What happens now, and of course, by the saying that, I'm not drawing any parallel between the two, unlike what the left likes to do, but obviously Brexit and Trump and so on is also a reaction over here, although obviously it has ideologically practically nothing in common with fascism. But yeah, so those reactions definitely happen. Now, as you mentioned, oikophobia had already taken place, had already started before World War I, but certainly World War I is something that certainly gave rise, or not gave rise, but that was able to fuel oikophobia. And you have, I mean, I mentioned aesthetics in the beginning. That's something I'm working on. Obviously, the rise of Dada right after World War I, for example, that's a perfect example of of that phenomenon. They react against World War I, which makes them react against the entire civilization that in their eyes produced World War I. And I would say that's a pretty major category error on the part of the Dada artists, but maybe that's a whole other story. But in any case, yeah, so it certainly fueled that, and the reaction that you mentioned then does happen. And the reaction can be either worse than the disease, or in some cases, as I would say in the case of the United States, better, a lot better than the disease. But yeah. Mm.
I mean, if we embed this concept of oikophobia in kind of the broader historical trajectory, that's of course a tricky question. But one argument or one strong belief that even nowadays we seem to ascribe to is this idea, the search for truth, right? Kind of we want to find out what is objectively true. But if we look at the cultural civilizational development, both I guess in the West and outside of the West, do you think that Nietzsche got it right? And I'm simplifying here his perspective, but that at some point will matters more than truth. I mean, truth is there, of course, no doubt about this. But when it comes to social change is not necessarily driven by us figuring out, in ever greater detail how the world truly works. But it is that in history, time and again, small groups, individuals, charismatic individuals pop up, and they have the willpower then to kind of bend society, if you want, or bend the arch of history, at least temporarily, to their will, without glorifying it. But I think this is one of the big dilemmas here. Is it really truth and an ever better understanding of the objective forces of the world that drive history forward? Or is it the occasional rise of these movements, these figures that are not so much concerned about what is objectively true, but they have, as Nietzsche would say, a will to power. And this is something that we also see nowadays in many movements. So that very often the debate on, that one political movement says A, the other political movement says B, and the expectation is that whichever of those two positions is closer to the objective truth is the one that ultimately will be victorious. Or could it be the case that no, the position where those who believe in it are willing to do more, are willing to fight to the death, if you want, that's probably going to be a more decisive factor than whether or not it's objectively true?
Yes, I guess I would say two questions there, probably. So in terms of the importance of truth, the importance of will rather than truth, yes. And I mean, this is something that which I think also is a little bit embedded in your question, namely the idea that we are a little too obsessed with moral purism, certainly here in the United States. I mean, my current federal government is very obsessed with moral purism rather than with willpower. This is actually something that Trump understood a lot better, namely that he was much more of a realpolitik kind of a person and sort of a Machiavellian to some extent. I use that word cautiously, but that certainly is a lot more useful than the sort of moral purism that we see when it comes to what drives history. It's what I don't like about this sort of discussion when people argue about the great man theory of history and the sort of the more deterministic view of history is that it tends to be a sort of a zero-sum game in this sort of discussion. And as I would say, as so many other things, it's a bit of both, I would say. I think the willpower of important men in history, and again, something one can say without making a moral judgment either way about them, that is certainly something that plays a role, but they're still hampered by what they can do by the circumstances in which they find themselves. I guess in that sense, I take a fairly Hegelian view. I don't consider myself Hegelian, but in the sense that there are certain historical moments or certain historical phases in which certain things are possible. And then you do have some kind of a great man, great quote-unquote man who seizes that moment and is able to take the possibilities of his historical moment to the fullest extent. But he can't do more than that. That is to say, he can't do more than what the historical circumstances will allow. That might sound almost tautological, but it's important to keep in mind in the sense that there are still, mass psychology is still an important factor. A great man can only do what mass psychology will allow him to do. And that is true. I mean, that's true for somebody like Napoleon. That's true for somebody like Trump, Julius Caesar, anyone that one can mention, Hitler too, for that matter. And so I see it as a little bit of both, but the devotion to truth. I mean, there's a lot to unpack here, but the whole idea of the arch of history bends towards justice or toward truth, everything like that. It's a load of nonsense in my view. We have to take a much more realistic view of things. And to use a bit Nietzschean language, since you mentioned him, we have to take a much more tragic view of history. We have to accept that there is no salvation, there is no messianic era or anything like that. You mentioned this sort of triumphant attitude that people had. One can talk about the triumphant attitude that people had at the end of the Cold War as well, which is the same kind of a mistake. The mistake that people made after the end of the Cold War was that they forgot the tragic view of history, which is to say that there's always going to be something that's going to come back, and there's always going to be some reason for us to watch our backs, so to speak, and to understand that if for a moment we believe that things are going to now remain as they are, and we'll be able to just enjoy the fruits of our labors and so on, that's the moment when the decline sets in. That's the moment when we open ourselves up to these new threats that we now see all around us. So, yeah.
No, it makes a lot of sense. And do you think that, because I think that dovetails nicely with what you just said, that one element, because you mentioned moral purism, that moral purism might on the outside seems like something that is very strong, but in fact that it is a sign of weakness. And what I mean by this is, if you're confident in your civilization, in yourself, you're probably much more capable of being pragmatic. Now, you mentioned somebody like Donald Trump, and I think this is for me always one of the most astounding character traits of Donald Trump. Now, he's definitely not a moral purist, but I think he's a very confident man. But that allows him, I believe, to be much more pragmatic than he gets credit for. I mean, if you look at things like his position on abortion or same-sex marriage or foreign policy, like the very fact that he has kind of as his guiding star, and I think that is a position he sincerely holds, that he is an American patriot, right? When he talks about making America great again, I think he really believes in the greatness of America, but he also sees, I think, as you mentioned or alluded to before, that in order to fulfill America's promise, sometimes you have to be a little bit pragmatic, in the same way as a Thomas Jefferson was, right? In the same way as a George Washington was. So kind of the baseline was strong confidence in their whatever you want to call it, in their culture, their civilization, their country, but they were aware that you cannot treat it, as you mentioned, kind of from a purely morally puristic perspective. You have to be pragmatic, whether it's the Louisiana Purchase, whether it's the Monroe Doctrine, and also so you say you're isolationist, but you understand that sometimes you can't be, right? You say you're going to keep out of the dabblings of the European powers, but you know that sometimes you have to make deals with them. In the same way Trump does it. And very often it seems that when you look at wokeness, for example, right, that in fact it is so dominant in the discourse. But in fact, as an ideology, it almost strikes one as weak because it is so morally pure.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it
tends to be.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Right. Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And the connection that one can also make between them is essentially vanity, and vanity is the vice that fuels both oikophobia and this moral purism, and that's why oikophobes tend to be the ones who are morally pure. Now, one can find different kinds of moral purity. Obviously, I don't want to say that it's a uniquely an oikophobic phenomenon. But the thing is, why does someone become an oikophobe? Well, then someone becomes an oikophobe because he thinks that he is better than his surrounding civilization. I understand, the oikophobe, I see how my civilization has gone wrong. I see the sins that it has committed, and I'm better than that. And now I set out to right those wrongs. And so I hate my own civilization. I despise it because it's evil. It has committed all of these crimes. And now we're going to do something better. So that's vanity that drives oikophobia. And that, of course, one can see how that relates very strongly to moral purism. Whereas someone who is not an oikophobe might say, okay, well, I don't necessarily say that everything that my civilization has ever done was morally good, but moral purism isn't the end all and be all. And so someone who is not a moral purist tends not to be oikophobic. And so that goes hand in hand. We see our current administration here in the United States is certainly very oikophobic, and it's also very morally purist. A lot of hand-wringing about the deaths in Gaza or what have you, about preaching to the Chinese about human rights over there, or preaching to all different kinds of countries around the world about trans rights and so on. not realizing that all of these things, whether one is, regardless of what one may think about a particular issue, this sort of moral purism is not conducive to a sound geopolitics where you have to be a lot more pragmatic. So oikophobia and moral purism go hand in hand in that way, go very naturally hand in hand.
If you want to see the full conversation with Benedict, please head over to Brussels Signal. I'll link to it in the comment section, and watch the full conversation. And also consider subscribing to the work of Brussels Signal. It's a fantastic new publication. You'll find it very informative, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again next week for the next episode of Hammer Time.